Thank you so much for being with us this evening. So for those of you I haven't met, my name is Courtney. I'm currently the WAPA Programming Chair, and I am a faculty in anthropology at George Mason University. So very, very excited to be here and to introduce our event this evening. So I want to particularly thank Kathleen Crane, who brought this idea to us, and just really excited to be able to host everyone this evening. So I will just introduce our panelists and say a few words, but then I will turn it over to the panel to share. So our event this evening is the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology presents Disciplinary Standards for Professional, Practicing, and Applied Anthropologists. And we have several panelists with us this evening. We have Matt Stauffer, who has also graciously set up our Zoom for us and will be running our Zoom for us this evening. We have Tanya Rodriguez from Hormel Foods. And I want to say, please, when your turn, please introduce yourself, because I most likely am not pronouncing names correctly. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing correctly. So please feel free to also say your name and introduce yourselves. Ryle Nolan from Purdue University, Neil Tashima from LTG Associates, Erica, is it Havermail from Syracuse University, Danello Institute for Veterans and Military Families. And then we have Kathleen Crane from LTG Associates. And I said them in the reverse order. So I will now turn it over to the panelists to begin the discussion in whatever order they see fit. Thank you so much. And just to let you know, we are recording as WAPA practice, we do record and Matt graciously posts them on the YouTube channel. And I am happy to also share that link with everybody so you all can catch up on our past events and watch this event in the future. And I'll put that in the chat. And now I will turn it over to our esteemed panelists. And please help me giving a round of applause to having everyone here this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney. And welcome, everyone. We are delighted to join you this evening for this presentation of WAPA's Disciplinary Standards for PPA Anthropologists. We'll say it that quickly going forward. I'm Kathleen Crane, and I'm co-chair with Erica Havermail of NAPA's Professional Development Committee, which developed the standards. Today, the standards will be presented by the committee members, and Courtney has already introduced us, but let's go around, starting with Matt, and just a quick intro of each of us. To you, Matt.
Hi, my name is Matt Stauffer. I've been a WAPA member for a few years now and helping run the back-end function of the event program. So thank you.
Ryle.
I'm Ryle Nolan, retired professor of anthropology at Purdue, and I am a WAPA member. I'm very happy to be. Thank you.
Erica.
I am Erica Havermail, and Courtney, fantastic job. Not many people get it right on the first shot, so good on you. As Courtney said, I work at the Danello Institute for Veterans and Military Families based out of Syracuse University as a program evaluator, and I serve as our co-chair for this committee. I am not a WAPA member. This is one of my first times interacting with this organization. I'm very excited to be here.
Neil.
Howdy, folks. I'm Neil. I'm one of the managing partners in LTG Associates. Kathleen, can you hear?
And I'm very proud to be a WAPA member, but I'm also extremely proud to have co-led with Kathleen 6 teams of anthropologists that have been recognized for praxis over the years. And that may be the crowning achievement of my career, is having had the opportunity to work with all those anthropologists, but also to be part of WAPA.
Tanya.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tanya Rodriguez. I am the cultural anthropologist for Hormel Foods Corporation. I am not a WAPA member, but I got here as quick as I could. Super excited to be with y'all. Y'all look like y'all do a lot of dynamic and cool things, so happy to be a part of this. Thanks for the invite.
And as I said, I'm Kathleen Crane. I'm the other managing partner in LTG Associates and a loud, proud WAPista for many decades. So our plan this evening for this presentation is to first provide you with the why we created the standards and then the how, and finally to discuss the standards themselves. We believe the standards are both aspirational and achievable and lay good groundwork for the conversations that are needed about PPA anthropology and how we see standards for and the quality of our work. This presentation is intended to begin that conversation. PPA anthropologists are invited to help us to continue to define and refine the standards and to continue to review them to ensure currency, relevance, and actionability. Throughout the presentation, we ask that you use the chat feature and post questions, ideas, and identify opportunities and barriers. Our presentation will take about 45 minutes, and we do this as a flow. And then we look forward to a conversation with all of you. And again, thank you for coming. And with that, Eric and I will lead off with the why standards. And I'm going to provide a little bit of context. For those of you who may not know NAPA, we are the only national North American organization solely dedicated to serving PPA anthropologists. And we define PPA anthropologists as those working in government, private sector, and nonprofit sectors. That's the professional and practicing groups. And the applied anthropologists as those in an academic setting whose work is focused on change making in the world. PPAs are the largest group of anthropologists in the US, and the disciplinary dominance will only continue to grow. We're entering the workforce where anthropological skills are receiving increased recognition, which should increase demand. This, in turn, makes it imperative that we, as PPA anthropologists, set standards for our own skills development is one thing, standards for our work is something else. Resources have been growing, but many PPA anthropologists are out in the universe alone. And having standards that they can look to, having organizations like WAPA and NAPA with which they can participate is important. So that's the context in which, okay. So few schools in our reckoning are fully prepared to train PPA anthropologists in the work that they're going to be undertaking. There are certainly some wonderful schools that are doing excellent training, but the breadth of the training that it takes and the mentoring that we think is critical to develop a full professional is not yet offered in many places. No one has prepared grounded guidance for what good and ethical PPA anthropologists will do in their work. Erica.
You come off mute. I apologize. And the disciplinary standards are important guidance for our PPA anthropologists, particularly for those that don't have ongoing disciplinary engagement and support, for those who aren't actively engaging or able to actively engage with the larger discipline through meetings or through connection with other anthropologists. So these disciplinary standards are not only for them, but are also necessary to ground all training materials for PPA anthropologists that are to be developed in the future, which is one of the things that this committee is hoping to tackle next. The conversation around disciplinary standards really does create an opportunity for a broader discussion about what the future of anthropology can and should look like.
All right. So this document is really designed to provide guidance and support for PPA anthropologists and to stimulate discussion. Although there will always be outliers and exceptions, the following provides a set of guidelines really for the conduct of good anthropology and for professional practicing and applied anthropologists. That said, this is a living document. So it's dynamic, it can grow, it can change, but not without your participation. So again, this is not something set in stone. This is something that we're asking you to engage with. And we expect and we encourage discussion and debate. We just don't want to get caught and mired in polemics and not get anywhere. We want to get somewhere. So instead, consider this more of an invitation to co-create really the future of anthropology, the future of the discipline and its practice. And so now I will turn it over to Matt, and he's going to go over the methods that we use to define these concepts.
Thank you, Tanya. The committee relied heavily on iterative processes to formulate these standards. We met every other week over the course of approximately 8 months. Our process began with an exercise to generate a list of disciplinary methods, skills, and knowledge areas grouped into 3 branches. These branches were career basics, career development, and advanced skills and methods. From this list, the committee distilled what we considered to be the essential fundamentals underlying the professional practice of anthropology. We then debated and quizzed one another on the factors underlying what we consider to be good anthropology, again, utilizing an iterative discussion process, with the set of fundamentals used as grounding parameters during the discussions. In this way, we were able to develop the elements that make up each fundamental, along with a non-exhaustive list of identifiable behaviors or evidence that represent each element. The fundamentals, together with their constituent elements and example identifiable behaviors, became NAPA's disciplinary standards for the practice of good anthropology. To further test these standards, the committee also considered examples and instances of what we considered to be poor anthropology, and discussed how proper application of the disciplinary standards would have prevented or mitigated adverse outcomes from poor anthropological practices. It's important to note that the iterative discussion surrounding these disciplinary standards was a crucial aspect of the committee's work. Iterative discussion has allowed us to formulate, discuss, and communicate the essence and substance of the standards, and elevate them beyond something like a surface-level checklist of behaviors and perspectives to pay lip service to. In order to organize and properly communicate the disciplinary standards to a broader audience, we employed concept mapping, which Ryle will discuss further. Ryle?
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. So concept maps. We wanted to avoid sort of endless discussions which didn't resolve anything, and so we adopted this form of mapping as a way to both frame our discussions and structure them a little bit, and to make sure that we were going in the same direction. Those of you that are familiar with Alice in Wonderland know that Humpty Dumpty had this conversation with Alice at one point, and he said this. He said, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." And Alice said back to him, "The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things." Which Humpty Dumpty replied, "The question really is, which is to be master? That's all." Now, we're all very familiar with that kind of situation where we start off thinking we know what a term or a concept means, only to discover that we all have different interpretations. And then sometimes that turns into a struggle for dominance. Who's going to be the smartest person in the room? It helps, therefore, to have some basic agreement on terms. It's also important to acknowledge that such agreements are subject to revision and change as our discussion proceeds. So concept maps are a way of unpacking a term or a concept into its different components. It's not intended to be definitive. Instead, it's a tool for thinking about what we mean by what we say. So once our group had its list of fundamentals, or what we're calling here core concepts, okay, which if you look at the little table there in front of you, that's on the left-hand side, that's left-hand column. Once we had what we called core concepts, we proceeded to break these things down into constituent elements, and the box shows you how this was done. The left-hand column lists the core concept. In the example I'm using right here, it's the first one of these, called self-awareness. We then proceeded to list some of the main attributes or components of this concept. What do we mean when we say self-awareness? And so we brainstormed lists of things and came up with these. We came up with 4 that we could all agree on. Then for each of these 4, we went back and we listed observable indicators. So if you're talking about avoiding bias, how do you know? What's an example? What are indicators of that? Now we're going to take up each one of these core concepts in turn in just a moment. But to show you quickly how this works, look at the first element. We'll go right back to the beginning, what we're calling avoiding bias. That's one of the first elements under self-awareness. What counts as evidence of avoiding bias? We listed 4 different things: feedback from peers, clients, and partners, professional reviews of our work, comparisons with various sets of external standards, and finally, personal attention to reflexivity in what we do. This probably doesn't exhaust all of the possibilities, and we would love to hear from you if you've got things to add or things to sort of modify. But that's the way we did this. By breaking down these broad concepts in this way, we think that we've helped to clarify what we are actually talking about here. And at the same time, we hope we've provided both a framework and a springboard for further discussion and elaboration. So I'm going to turn this over to Kathleen now, who's going to outline the 7 core concepts that we came up with.
Not to be confused with the 7 deadly sins. These are the 7 concepts, and I'm simply going to read them. There's self-awareness, cultural relativism, engagement and service, empowerment and advocacy, transparency and accuracy, accessibility, and command of our craft. I'm sorry, Erica, I stepped on your lines. We understand that there is duplication that you will see across the standards, and that is by design.
So as we walk through these 7 concepts, the 7 standards, I want you to ask yourself, like, are there any core concepts that we're missing? Are there other elements that we're missing? How can these be used? And I love that people are already putting some barriers in the chat, potential challenges, right? Like, how do we disseminate these? So some of those logistical questions are fair game here. So please keep that coming. This document's really intended to guide, again, PPAs in their pursuit of their profession. And how can they do that if they're not part of those bigger structures? So keep those questions coming. And as with any endeavor, we know that we might have missed something, or we need to clarify something or change something outright. So it's imperative that you lend your voice here. Again, this is a collective creation of our craft, an evolution of our craft. But before we begin to review the concepts, I tend to wax poetic, and I love to call on our ancestors for wisdom. And Margaret Mead once said that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so I want us to consider ourselves a small and mighty group, because in this spirit, we can really further the practice of anthropology and help change and heal and inform the world. And so with that kind of spirit in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to discuss our first standard of self-awareness.
Thank you, Tanya. Our first core disciplinary standard is maintaining self-awareness. We feel that a strong sense of self-awareness is essential for understanding how you influence or react to study participants, stakeholders, and partners in research. It also helps you to understand how your experiences and personality influence your own critical analysis of the data under review. Through our discussions, we assess that this disciplinary standard is composed of basic elements including, but not limited to, avoiding bias, practicing humility, presentation of self in professional contexts, and analysis of our own behavior. Avoiding bias means doing the work of examining our own frameworks, analyses, and observations about our participants, stakeholders, and partners. We have to understand ourselves to know how our experiences color or cloud our own analyses. Some observable indicators of avoiding bias include eliciting feedback from peers, clients, and partners, seeking professional reviews of our work by others, employing measures against disciplinary, industry, and community standards, and practicing reflexivity. By practicing humility, we acknowledge and embrace that we don't have all the answers. We must be open to the thoughts and opinions of others and understand and accept our own limitations. Some indicators of practicing humility include recognizing your own personal and professional limits, a willingness to admit the things you don't know or can't do, a willingness to ask for and receive advice, an openness to continual improvement and professional development, and a willingness to recognize and confront hubris. Presentation of self in professional contexts means being aware of our own tone and demeanor, and being cognizant of how we represent ourselves, and how that representation reflects on our partners, participants, stakeholders, and the discipline of anthropology as a whole. Indicators of remaining aware of presentation of self include eliciting and listening to feedback from others, identifying areas for development and improvement, and identifying models of effective self-preservation. A through line of all of these basic elements is the ability to be reflexive and examine and analyze our own behavior. Being able to look in the mirror, ask hard questions, and see yourself with unfettered eyes is an essential skill for maintaining self-awareness. For analyzing our own behavior, indicators include understanding professionalism and its components, finding ways to signal, demonstrate, and utilize professional tenets in work situations, and privileging purpose over personal interests. Ryle will discuss our next core concept. Ryle?
Sorry, yes, thank you, Matt. So the second one that we have is one that's familiar to all of us, kind of one of our stocks in trade. It's cultural relativism. This is a term that we are very familiar with. And because it's so important to our work, we really wanted to unpack this as much as possible to understand its various aspects and dimensions. So through our discussions, we identified 8 different elements of cultural relativism, and these are listed in the second column here. They include open-mindedness, which involves being neutral and non-directive, avoiding stereotypes and unfair and offensive comparisons. Another element is thoroughness, asking more than one question, asking questions of different people to get a more complete picture. Attention to context is the third, making sure that we get a full picture of the situation, taking care to note the surrounding circumstances as we work, making sure too to tease out the connections between one thing and another. Then we have the need to pause, consider, and reformulate, which means taking the time to think, reflect, and revise as we work, reserving our conclusions until we have a more complete picture, being open throughout the process to changing our minds about what we're seeing and hearing as new data come in. Patience is the next one. We cannot force trust or confidence. We cannot force understanding, nor can we engineer just the right moment to learn something. We need to allow time for events to unfold at their own pace and be ready when the right moment occurs. Empathy is the next one. We need to take the time to both understand another's perspective and to attempt to feel what the other person feels as a way to develop further understanding. We also need to understand and acknowledge what another may need or want from us as a response. Trust and respect are a big part of this. Trust in many ways is what makes good anthropology possible. We need to understand, first of all, how to demonstrate respect toward our partners, and building on that respect, how to create bonds of trust. We also need to understand how to demonstrate professional behavior and standards in our work situations. And then finally, there's knowing the limits. We have to acknowledge that there are sometimes limits to relativism. We cannot ethically employ cultural relativism in situations where individuals are being harmed. In some cases, these situations have a legal aspect, which we need to be aware of, as in the treatment of children, other vulnerable individuals or groups, and knowledge of or participation in criminal or quasi-criminal activities. So in conclusion, we realize that cultural relativism is a fairly complex concept. We should also note that the employment of cultural relativism in the workplace often involves a considerable investment of time. And although we've tried to elicit the main aspects or elements of this core concept here, we would be very interested in your ideas or suggestions for other elements that could be added. Thank you for that, and I'll turn it back to Kathleen now. Thanks.
The next core concept is engagement and service. We believe that the tools and skills of anthropology are very potent. We walk into people's lives, they trust us, they share their perspectives, they share their secrets, they share their culture with us. With that, we believe comes responsibility, and a responsibility to engage in service even as we are doing our job. And so for engagement and service, we identified 4 basic elements. And the first is do no harm. And I think everyone would see that kind of right away. That's straightforward. That we should ensure that safety and harm avoidance are active elements in all of the work that we conduct. And that we have an affirmative obligation to avoid harm to all others, and an affirmative duty to being responsible for the conditions of engagement in our research. This is all when it is within our ability to control. We're not expecting that every engagement we will have the authority of Thor. And actively promote safety in what we do. Striving to do good is a very important part of our aspiration as professional and practicing anthropologists. Focus our work on resulting in better conditions and outcomes. Always consider diversity, equity, and inclusion of populations in our work, and promote the best outcomes for the community. And again, we recognize that there are limitations. With knowledge comes the responsibility for that knowledge, and we see a lot of ways in which we must aspire to be responsible, to learn and then use that learning in the conduct of working with communities, working with organizations, and understanding that the knowledge gained is on loan to us. We don't own it. We don't get to take it home, put it in a box, and decide who should know that. It is important that we share that. Respecting the agency of the community or the organization to share, to not share, to use information, not use information is critical. Assuming an affirmative responsibility to share our information back with those who share with us. It's very easy to gain information and to walk away and come to grand conclusions, and the community or the organization is saying, but what did it mean? We think it's important to be motivators of communication across groups, and then leaving as we are no longer needed. And reporting, and this goes back to what we were just talking about, reporting information that pertains to security, well-being, safety, and so on, and breaches the limits of cultural relativism. And finally, approach to service. And this may be one of the more controversial pieces. We've already talked about cultural relativism, but embracing the ambiguity and complexity as the reality of people and cultures, and not simplifying for ease or to report something that's straightforward. Using discomfort for learning. I don't know anybody who's been in the field who hasn't been sincerely uncomfortable. It's part of what we do. Focusing on listening without filters, not thinking about our next product or our next article or how this is going to fit into the whole that we're creating. And this goes back to an earlier standard concept. It's very important. And we've already talked about admitting limits, supporting the value of complex findings. Anthropologists are often charged with being too complicated. What we do is too complicated. What we learn is too complicated. Well, life is complicated, and we need to learn to be good purveyors of complicatedness in ways that people can take up and use. And then stepping back and allowing others to engage and move things forward. We don't own it. We're there for a time. We come, we go. Let the people who live take it forward. And again, having courage and conviction tempered by humility and respect. This is bordering on sainthood when we recognize that. But we think it's important aspirational sainthood. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tanya.
Thank you, Kathleen. I am presenting the fourth standard, which is empowerment and advocacy, and it acknowledges our role as potential agents of change with and for people, the people that we study, the communities that we influence and study, and the issues that we study. And so I love some of the stuff that's already going on in the chat that I think really speaks to this particular standard and others. But one of the first elements of empowerment and advocacy is capacity building. What does that really mean? And it's really about identifying and edifying sites for action, right? And so you want to be able to find those salient intervention points, what's going to make the most impact. But it's really about asking, like, what is the most appropriate point of intervention? Not only what you can do, but what you should do and should not do, and negotiating with the people that you are interacting with to figure out what those points are. It's also about that ability to design with others and carry out those interventions that they're not only effective as we see them effective, but meaningful to the people and to the context, right? Again, this is a relationship. This isn't a top-down type of thing. So very important in how we're approaching the work that we're doing. Another element is representation. So how we see and project both others and ourselves into the context, into even broader context as we disseminate information, right? So it's really about your ability and willingness to have partners. It says let, and I'm struggling with that word, but have partners determine how they will be represented and by whom they'll be represented. So for instance, like with storytelling, being able to see that as a collective, diverse and inclusive narrative. So for instance, in my work, we recently did a film on the Gullah Geechee culinary diaspora in the Carolinas and Georgia. And one of the things that was really important to us is that the stories were told from a person of the Gullah Geechee community. I'm sorry, I keep saying it wrong. From the community. And one of the things that we loved about this particular writer is that she had a Zora Neale Hurston-esque spirit about her. And so she used a lot of the vernacular speech and a lot of the vocabulary of the people that she was familiar with to tell that story. So how much more powerful that story was in that voice, right? Because it truly, literally gave the people the voice. And so very empowering to us and to them as well. And again, wanting to give space and honor how people represent themselves. So sometimes some types of media are not appropriate. Sometimes the names of the dead are not shared. So always making sure that we adhere to those things. But if we can incorporate the people themselves in telling that story, how super powerful that is. Again, going back to this idea of media. How does basic media work? What is acceptable in the communities that we're working in? What do the people think about how that media works for or against them? Can be super powerful in terms of video, in terms of photograph, and so forth. So very important in terms of how we're representing people. The other thing is accuracy. So that's a difficult one, right? To be accurate, to say, I got it. I figured y'all out. I know all of these things. But what it's really about is the spirit is getting it more right than not. And so it's really checking our work to ensure accuracy and is practicing what we preach, right? Because often an anthropologist is going, no, 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 hold on. If we got X, Y, and Z aspect of this issue, or this culture, these things are important, and we always add and kind of course correct. So we're saying we need to be responsible for that in our practice and our research. And so no anthropologist should be an island to themselves, right? Really checking your work feeds the research spirit of the discipline and really helps us keep those parameters in check, making sure we have a community of other anthropologists to help us work through different issues and so forth, and also maintaining good documentary records, right? So sometimes your work can be the very preservation of a culture, right? A voice, a history of a thing. And sometimes your work can be controversial and it can hurt people if it gets in the wrong hands and so forth. So making sure that we understand, well, do we have a system of documentation and storage and so forth? Very important as well to do that very well and very safely. Then there's effectiveness, which is being meaningfully impactful. Sorry. So doing some good. So it's not only about knowing what works in the culture, but also in the structures and what are the procedures? How can you disseminate information? When is it appropriate? And so forth. How do you gain access to different outlets and platforms? But I really want to concentrate, especially with some of the stuff that was said in the chat, is understanding the metrics of success within the cultural context. So I went to a conference from this big leader in consumer insights. And one of the things they were talking about was urban culture. And they were talking about different groups in urban culture. And they were saying, well, these are not people who are successful. And they were saying, they really care a lot about fingernails, like having nice nails and certain jewelry and riding around in the cars on 20-inch rims and those things. They don't care about 401ks and college. And it was like, hold on, wait a minute. Because what is success? And there are certain things that maybe in certain cultures, in certain areas and regions, that those are the metrics of success. Those are the things to look a certain way, to present yourself a certain way, to offer certain foods. Those are metrics of success versus a 401k versus a college degree and so forth. So that credibility, what is it in that cultural context, is super powerful. And to, what was said in the chat in terms of looking at your class, checking your ethnic bias, making sure that you're getting the narrative based on what they believe. That's super important, even when it conflicts with yours, because as Kathleen mentioned, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And if there's a conflict, you have to be able to say that. So then the other thing is the attention to an identification of potential harm. So as Kathleen mentioned, first do no harm, but do some good. And it's really about understanding and respecting sensitive areas. Sometimes you may not think that something's sensitive. I work in the food industry and people will say, well, food's not sensitive. And I'll be like, I absolutely disagree. Food is one of the most political hot button issues. For you not to have food, for you to eat the incorrect food, all of those things are laden with judgment. And so really trying to be respectful about how sensitive is, what you're doing really is, and what are the parameters of that, and how can that information be misused if you see that people maybe are feeding things that would be technically not healthy to children and that type of thing. How can they be maligned at school and in other contexts? So super important to know about that. And then being able to really know whether there's any nefarious sources outside that you need to consider in terms of how that information could be misused or misconstrued. And so we need to really ask ourselves, like, monitor the difficulties that this could potentially cause, and ask ourselves, how do we protect those people that we study? How do we protect them? How do we align with them? And also understanding that ethnographic refusal is sometimes what people really need to do to be self-empowered, to be self-preserving. So when you get a no, being able to respect that no and understand why some people have to say no is also very important. So I love the things in the chat already about empowerment and advocacy, you pushing the envelope, helping us think broader and deeper. And it's really great because this standard is really about dynamics of science, but of passion and intent as well. So I ask you to put, any other elements that you believe we should adopt here, please, again, put those in the chat. But dovetailing really nicely with this standard is transparency and accuracy, and Neil will discuss that now.
So first thing I'd like you all to do is take a deep breath and stretch. We've been at this for over a half hour now, and for us older people, sitting there that long is a little bit difficult. One of the things I've enjoyed about working with this committee is that we've been practicing all of these elements as we've been doing our work. Testing them out, seeing if we can trust each other, if we share common values, if our beliefs are making sense, and talking to other anthropologists about this as we've been going along. The other thing I've really enjoyed is that you're starting to hear how these themes weave through all of the elements that we've been talking about. And so for transparency and accuracy, you all know what AAA says, you all know what SFAA says about how one should do this stuff. In the very first AAA meeting I went and presented on the NAPA ethics statement, the chair of the session said, well, jet set mercenaries and beltway bandits really have no morals and no ethics. I'm not sure they belong in this meeting. And I had just finished reading what NAPA was talking about their ethics. And I watched the back of the room where all professional anthropologists start to turn very red and be very angry. And that got me thinking, there's a very clear difference in how an academic person sees ethics and how we as professionals practice our ethics. Part of this is the transparency and accuracy of what we do, and it starts with record keeping. This seems like a no-brainer, but I've heard too many students say, I'm not taught what to do with my field notes. I'm not taught how to store them. And it's getting more complex because we have to figure out how you deal with various electronic media and what's going to be able to be supported in 15 years that has a future we don't understand. Some of us have floppy disks floating around our offices yet that you can't read on anything. They have primary data sitting on it. Others of us have boxes of interviews that were done before informed consent was an issue. What do you do with that stuff? How do you deal with that? And once you figured that out, how do you keep extending the life of those recorded materials? Also, where do you put them? That's archiving is a real issue. Disclosure, working with partners to establish an information plan. You're going to share this process, but it means you have to have thought it out beforehand, and you have to be willing to adapt it as you're working through your project with whoever you're working with. Negotiating reciprocity with partners for information and field materials. Too often, I think the old model of anthropology, these are my field notes, and I don't share them with anybody because they're private and they're personal, and somebody might abuse them. But you need to think about this when you're designing your work, if you're talking about truly being transparent and having a reciprocal relationship with the people who talk with you. Negotiating boundaries and procedures with clients for handover of information. How are you going to do that? What does that mean in the context of all the other things we've been talking about, of who's right, whose values are supported, and what normal behavior would be in the context you're working in? So being clear about terms of anonymity and confidentiality. In some contexts, everybody wants to know everybody, so you have to let that go. In other places, they won't talk with you unless you're someplace entirely different where nobody can see you. So negotiating this, being aware of this before you go to the field is critical. My assumption is that academic departments are teaching this to students as part of your formal education. I don't know that for a fact. I hope and I believe. Being clear with respondents about limits of control of data. Anybody that has a federal contract or grant You've signed away a lot of control over your data just simply by taking that grant and agreeing to all of the slowdown clauses in the federal acquisition regulations and OMB circulars that are inherent in signing that contract. You need to read the fine print, because it doesn't work after the fact to say, well, I didn't know that, or that doesn't apply to me. I'm special. Anthropology is special. You need to think about this as a condition of your funding and how you're going to explain that to people you're working with. And clearly communicate breaches and mistakes. That's really important. All of this is really important, actually. But being honest with your community members about what's happened if something has gone wrong, and this goes back to some of the other core concepts that we've been talking about. Review and feedback. And again, this is a theme that's come through some of the other core concepts. Checking finding interpretations with partners, always a good thing to do. Correcting errors and omissions, a really important part of what's going on, and incorporating new material where relevant. Development and maintenance of professional networks for discussion of ethical concerns, challenges, and peer reviews. I was just on a call the other day with an anthropologist who was just really torn about something that had gone on in one of her projects and had no idea what to do. So I said, we'll call the NAPA Ethics Committee and here's somebody to talk with. But in just talking with her about what she'd run into, it gave her ideas about how she could resolve some of her own conflicts internally about what had happened and how she could move forward. Wasn't telling her what to do, it was asking her what's appropriate in your context. So, review and feedback, checking findings, all these kinds of things are important, but it's also important to be self-aware and practicing a great deal of humility about what you do and can't do and what you do and don't know, so that as you're going through this, you can make corrective actions, you can allow for new information appearing, and you're always open for other opportunities for interpretation of what you're doing. And finally, protection. Understanding and employing appropriate research, evaluation, oversight, i.e. IRBs, review groups. I think these are all really important, particularly when you're working in complex, difficult situations. Some simple stuff, and I assume, again, everybody does this, but building in protections, passwords, encryption, into field materials, but also into how you transmit information across the internet. Are these all password protected data points, or are they available to anybody who happens to fall into your network? Retaining possession of materials where possible. Sooner or later, you get overwhelmed with stuff. Your terabyte drive becomes overwhelmed, and now you've got a 5 terabyte drive. It just keeps exploding, and the longer you practice anthropology, the more complicated it becomes to keep track of all this information. But it's important information to be able to deal with. And finally, arranging for your materials to be stored appropriately. This is one of those big questions I have about how do we do this? What does safe mean now? Is the cloud safe? And have you translated everything into an electronic format that will work in the cloud? Or have we signed everything over to Microsoft and said, it's not our problem, it's all there, I've done the best I can? I think too often these conversations don't go on in anthropology, and we need to make them apparent to new students, to professionals coming in, because you have to think about this before you start. With that, I'd like to turn this back to Erica and have her talk about the 6th core concept.
Thank you, Neil. And so our 6th core concept is accessibility, and this covers pretty much every stage of both the research process, but as some of the comments in the chat have alluded to, the core concept of accessibility really applies to our work in any environment. Accessibility should be paramount. So in the research respect, at the top, purposeful research design that's accessible to the full population, regardless of any factor, such as race, such as socioeconomic status, such as ability, and making sure that as we are designing research or outreach or any other process that we are engaging with as anthropologists, that we're very carefully analyzing our methods and our strategies to make sure that we aren't missing anybody and that we're making sure that everybody has a seat at the table. In terms of results and outreach, making sure that what we do is very purposefully disseminated in a manner that is accessible to the people that we are working with in a format that they can utilize. So that might mean open access. That could mean having audio versions of your outreach. That could mean having versions of your outreach in Braille. Other ways of making sure that it is accessible, different languages. And in so doing, exploring a variety of different formats. We have traditional print formats, but there's other options to convey findings and expand accessibility, such as webinars, such as presentations, such as infographics. And really underpinning all of this is the idea of accommodation and in making sure that at every stage of what we're doing as anthropologists, we are ensuring that we're meeting accessibility standards to ensure that everyone has access to what we are doing, and that where possible, we are accommodating different language styles as well as ability through the use of language labeling, visual representations, and audio interpretation of materials. With that, for our very last standard, I will turn it back over to Kathleen, Ryle, and Neil.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna take the first one of these things very briefly. Command of our craft is the seventh and the last of our core concepts, which touches on what it means to be a PPA anthropologist in the public workspace. We broke this concept down into 4 parts. And I'm going to take the first one, which is methodological expertise and precision. Methods, I think most of us would agree, are in many ways our stock in trade. We need to be fully conversant with the methods that are relevant to our work, and we need to be able to explain those methods to other people in terms which are clear and relevant to their concerns. We also need to be open to learning and applying new methods and approaches in our work. And I think that in particular is very important right now because based on what some of us have been looking at among the practitioner community, there are a variety of brand new methods or new takes on old methods which are being developed and used by practitioners. And a lot of this stuff is not finding its way back into the discipline, which I think is very much to our disadvantage. So I'll leave it there. And Neil, I think you're taking the next one, right?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Protection for participants. Again, this is one of those things I assume people are taught in graduate school and as undergraduates, but again, I may be wrong. So understanding the risks, benefits, and level of effort associated with the methods being used. This is always a good place to start from. Is it really realistic for you to propose doing 100 in-depth interviews when you've only got four or 5 days in the field? Negotiate the minimization of harm and risk with clients and partners before work begins. And again, this is about how you set up your project, how you think about what's going on. And in the chat, people were asking about managers. How do they fit into this? I think some of these principles fit with management work, and you have to sort of figure out how your anthropology informs your managing activities. Set up standards and procedures to maintain protection, confidentiality following field work. That goes back to your transparency and management of information. Being able to accurately discover and describe specific types of risk in specific situations for different stakeholders. And this means basically taking a 360-degree look at the world you're going to be entering and thinking not only of the immediate status, but downstream events and how they may affect what you're going to be doing and what's going to be happening with your information you are gleaning from your project. Prioritize the welfare of participants, respondents over the conduct of the project research. This is something interesting because I think a lot of anthropologists think their project is the most important thing in the world. And I'm using this very specifically as a personal pronoun, I, me, mine. A lot of our work, we're part of teams or we're part of a larger organization looking at things. So it's not my stuff. It is how my information fits into a larger picture. So how we prioritize the welfare of a respondent or participant may put us in conflict with the overall project or the overall management of what's going on. And you need to be thinking about these things before you actually get there. And finally, stay fully aware and up to date with changing ethical practices, participant protection practices. They're not significant shifts most of the time, but incrementally you will see change over time. The city program for human subjects protection training has gone from a pretty simple approach to human subjects protection to a very complex, multifaceted training program that does all kinds of things now. Picking and choosing what's most relevant and useful and important to our work becomes a more difficult challenge than it used to be. So I'll turn this over to Kathleen to do the third and fourth basic elements.
Thanks, Neil. So I get to wrap up the last two elements of commanding our craft. Command of our craft is a really interesting way of talking about this. It's not that we're going to be pretty good at what we're doing. The standard is that we will have command of our craft and that we will use our craft carefully and in ways that we've already talked about. There are documentation of our work. This almost goes without explanation. We must be careful and thoughtful and thorough about how we document our work. This is important for the credibility of our work. It is important in how we share information and what happens with that information when we are done. We do a lot of work with federal agencies and with foundations who take our findings and act on them. We want them to act on them. So being thorough, being understood to be thorough, to be credible is a very important part of what we do. And modeling our standards, methods, and ethics to others. And that's about presenting ourselves as careful professionals, being in collaboration with others and pointing out and offering guidance as collaborators when we see concerns about the work of partners and peers. We need to create a culture that says this is a gift. It's not a critique, it's a gift that I will share with you, and I expect in turn that you will share with me. This isn't a gotcha. This is, I've got you. I've got your back. And finally, to demonstrate how the employment of anthropology's methods and approaches are connected to the quality of the products, project, and results. We're very often humble to the point of people not recognizing that anthropology has happened to them. Good anthropology has happened to them. We need to demonstrate that. We need to share it with others while not claiming ownership of the data or the results, being mindful that our participation was important to the outcome and to the process being respectful and professional. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Erica. We're bringing it home, folks. Stay awake. It'll just be a couple minutes.
And this really touches on some of the very first questions in the chat. So thank you guys for being patient. We got here eventually. So in terms of next steps, we have been presenting these standards to a variety of PPA audiences. Yourselves, GAP, NAPA, we will be presenting it at the SFAAs coming up next month. And in so doing, having discussions, analyzing feedback and recommendation. We will be updating the standards as needed, and then recursively sharing with PPA anthropologists, sharing with other anthropologists as an ongoing dialogue about what needs to be changed, what needs to be included, what might be out of date as the years progress. Next slide. So, really at the beginning of the questions, how will these standards be reviewed and how will they be disseminated? So as I've said, we've already started doing this with the webinars that we've been holding. The standards are also currently housed on NAPA's website in an open access area. You do not need to be a member of NAPA to see our very first webinar, which is posted on that. And I will share that link in the chat in a moment if somebody else on the panel has not already done so. There is also a suggestion form on that website where individuals who are not necessarily able to engage in a live dialogue as one of these presentations will still be able to read the standards and voice their opinions on what should be changed, shifted, or included. Additionally, we are looking at bringing this to several classrooms around the country as different programs are open to receiving us, as well as the professional meetings. Though always open to more opportunities and pathways to get these in front of PPA anthropologists that might not have as many interactions with the larger discipline. I think that's it for me.
All right. So now it's your turn. And I've been very frustrated because I can't play with the chat because I'm running the slides. And I don't know if you can see me moving around when I'm running the slides. So some of this may have been addressed in the chat, but are there other core concepts? Are there other master concepts that we need to consider as we move forward? And everybody can come off mute.
Kathleen, can we ask if maybe you could stop sharing so we can see each other?
Sure.
Possible, just so we could see hands and
Yeah.
everything. That would be great. Great. Thank you so much. And I see you have a hand currently raised.
Joanne, hi.
Hi there. You probably had no time to look at the various things in the chat, right? But the one that I think might be something to think about in terms of moving this into the next level is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and what that means in relation to these concepts. Because, you know, we all know, all of us work in trans, whatever disciplinary environments. Most of us who are doing applied work or working in applied settings, not the academy, are, you know, identify ourselves as multiple things, and, you know, are part of teams that are not just anthropology. And we're not the token anthropologist in the room in these teams. We're part of a larger thing. So how does that work? I'd love to hear that somehow in these concepts, or maybe as another concept or a meta concept or a something.
James, somebody want to respond?
I'd be interested to see. I'd be interested to hear from you, having heard the concepts. How do you think they relate? Because it's kind of hard. Like, I work also on an interdisciplinary team, so I can see these relating in many ways to the work I do, but I'm also the lone anthropologist at what I do. So I'm very interested to see, like, do you see some of this resonating with you or not? Or do you see that it has application?
To be brutally blunt, which people know I am, it's more wonderful stuff, but I could look at that and I could substitute, instead of anthropology, have a dozen other disciplines or policy, you know, or whatever, and use the same concepts. And that's not saying that this isn't anthropological, because it clearly is. It's just that, you know, it clearly is working, and it's important. They're important professional concepts, I think, for any team, interdisciplinary team. So I don't want to say, so what makes it anthropological? Because I don't think we want to do that. I think it's better the way it is, but I think we need to somehow acknowledge that this isn't just anthropology, but it's the right way to approach transdisciplinary teamwork, and I don't know how to do that. I'm just raising it as an issue. Maybe Emily, who's raising her hand, does.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, I should come out here. I was having dinner, so I turned off the machine. I thought that the listing was incredibly thorough and comprehensive, and just an absolutely splendid exposition of what good anthropology should be. I was wondering if you had run it against some of the more artificial rules that have been developed outside of the country. One would be like for an agency such as UNICEF, which has a series of its policies and procedures. And then with regard to research ethics. And then the one that I think is the most challenging is the GDPR of the EU EC area. The Europeans have really tightened things up to a point where you have to destroy your data after you have completed using it. The levels of anonymity are extreme, but there are good reasons for it. But I just wondered if you had run your listing through the lens of, for example, the UNICEF ones or GDPR.
Good question. No, we haven't. We created these and we are sharing them. And now that you say that, that will be an interesting piece for us to take on. We wanted this to be as thorough as possible. We don't expect, and there was some, I'm loving the fact that I can finally see the chat. Thank you. I appreciate that we are not going to be able to do everything in every setting with every group, with every contract or grant. It's not expected that you will be able to do it, but that we will aspire, when possible, to do the very best anthropology. And Joanne, I agree with you. I would love to have everybody be a good anthropologist, but I think some of these are particularly anthropological in their expectations of how we will function because of the potency of the tools that we wield. I don't know that there's, do I know every discipline? No. I don't know that there's another discipline that gets quite as deeply into people's lives and culture as we do. And with that, I think it brings responsibility. So I agree. I would love for everybody to be able to do all of this. And Emily, we will take a look at those now. We are peculiarly North American at the moment. We've presented to the Global Anthropology Project to get some European input. We've offered to present to CASCA to look at the Canadian. So we're hoping to get lots of different lenses on this.
I think you will find it to be very interesting and also very challenging. I was thinking it goes both ways. Systems would be very challenged by this wonderful list that you and your group have developed. I mean, they would be just blown away by a lot of the points. So I think that it's there is a point for exchange around research ethics in this regard. You overlap, especially in such activities such as interviews and focus groups, where there is of great commonality. But when you get to issues of surveys combined with observations, that's when you begin to run into some really horny questions, especially because of the points that you have on yours. And I think it would give them a run for their money to look at this and say, we really missed the point, because there are a lot of really important points in here that are critically important when you're working in, for example, policy work, which I do all the time. And it is you have all sorts of things that I never say, but I'm thinking them. as part of the activity of consensus building or negotiation. So there's a lot here to explore. But I think this is a wonderful list for us. Just thank you so much for all the effort that all of you put into it.
Thanks, Emily. Suzanne.
This obviously was an incredible amount of work, and I really just thank you for all this. Congratulations, your brains must be very tired.
It's an a lot of fun, actually.
Probably so.
Yeah.
However, no, there is a real bias towards research in this. I agree with what you said, Lori. And I mean, I worked at NIH, which is a research organization, but that's not what my primary job was. I was a manager. I administered things. I was an advocate. I argued for ideas. I argued for the NIH to do this, not that, do it this way, not that way. And that was really where I had a really strong effect. Yet it was very anthropologically oriented, and I really had to know my group in order to do that. It would help if things were a little more relevant to the sort of work that I did, and probably the work that Lori does too. We're not all researchers, and
right.
And even if we're trying to bring about change, it's not necessarily through field work and research. So
that's one thing we want to try to do with this. We want to understand how different kinds of anthropologists work. I mean, I'm a practicing, like I said in the chat, I'm a practicing anthropologist, but I'm a data scientist, cybersecurity analyst, threat finance analyst. Like there's a bunch of hats that I wear, and we want to know how different people work so that we can figure out ways to tweak these standards to imply in any context, really. Like that's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for.
I think it's difficult, right? Because on one hand, you want anthropological standards that are distinct to the discipline, because there's no sense in having degrees in anthropology if there isn't something distinct about anthropology. But on the other hand, anthropologists by nature are very inclusive and very, accommodating and so forth. So you want to meld with other disciplines, and you want other disciplines to borrow. So like you have to be two things simultaneously. You have to be exclusive and different, but you also have to be open and inclusive. So it's a difficult rope to tread, and we're really happy to get this great and rich feedback. Thank you.
Martha.
Hi, that's an amazing piece of work. I'm sure it took a lot of patience. Yeah, I also worked at NIH, and I was thinking about the standards in terms of the teams that we have to be part of. And one of the things that I did struggle with in my years at NIH was the thought of the greater good versus something that I would see in front of me in the moment. The greater good in this context would be making sure that a grantee could keep their funding, which would mean having to meet the jot and tittle of what was in their funding agreement. And sometimes it was an easy fix, and sometimes, sadly, it would mean a lot of conflict with my upper management. And it's just, I heard many great things about how to work in the field, but I don't know that I heard enough about what it's like to be in the culture of being in a multidisciplinary team. People talk about being in interdisciplinary teams. I never saw that. But people, anthropologists, often work in multidisciplinary teams and managing that culture.
Okay. Thanks, Martha. Lori, and then Neil.
Thanks. I also want to echo everyone's praise. This is really a really terrific piece of thinking and of work. And I love the fact that it's guidelines rather than you must do this, you must do that. It's aspirational in a lot of ways. But I really feel that what I do and have always done is just not reflected here. As Suzanne said, I mean, yes, I'm a manager, but when you work in international development these days, and always in some ways, you do not go out and do the research. You train others to do the research. You train others in ethics and hope to God that they follow your ethics, knowing that it doesn't have anything to do with their culture, and they probably won't. And then also we need a group of, maybe WAPA can be this for us, but we need a group of anthropologists to discuss tricky ethical issues with. AAA used to have a committee to do that with. SFAA doesn't, as far as I know, and I don't know if NAPA does, but you need people that you can talk to. We're all really busy and not everyone has time to listen to. But for example, I instituted the practice of collecting life histories as part of MEL monitoring, evaluation, and learning. That can be triangulated again along with some quantitative data that someone else was, an anthropologist actually, was collecting, another subcontractor. Fine. What do I do with the life histories? Everyone wants them. They want to know. And I said, absolutely not. These are people's lives. We've promised them that we will not, but they could actually help. Parts of the lives could actually help. So I need a group to discuss things like that with. And that's something that I think we should think about in NAPA and WAPA and SFAA as well.
Yeah, I think we should definitely have something like that for WAPA and wherever else it takes us.
Wherever else it takes us. And then the other part of the question is that what do you do without, I mean, I don't actually fortunately know any anthropologists in my whole 40 years of practicing who fit into this category, but what would you do if someone egregiously violates norms? They violate the ethical guidelines.
Yeah. So, Lori, yes, NAPA has an ethics committee and they're available for conversations around sticky, complex issues. But the conversation about ethics is one that anthropologists need to have places to have easily. And we collectively have tried to launch this a number of times, and it hasn't gained traction or sustainability anyway. I don't know what you do about people who violate the standards. I think we're still in the space of developing what we think a really good anthropologist should be doing and acting like. And we know that everybody can't do this all the time. I'm a manager as well. I'm an employer, you know, and there are moments when I certainly can't enact some of this. But when I am a researcher, when I'm teaching research, I think it's important that I have these as my values, and then they are deployed as we can, with an understanding that we have to have guardrails on where we abandon them. I think that's so important, where we don't say, oh, it isn't convenient. It's got to be, it's not possible. And we have a really strong sense of it not being possible. I don't think it's just about classic research. And I think these are reasonable when we're doing, you know, focus groups, when we're doing interviews, when we're doing outreach work, when we're working with communities. I think there's a lot we can take from this. But again, they're aspirational and they're not going to work in every situation for every person. And we know that. We all live with multiple hats and multiple universes that won't keep us, won't allow us always to do everything we want to do. Neil and then Amanda, and then back to Joanne.
Several different thoughts. Thank you all. This is what we were attempting to do, I think, from the beginning, you,
Kathleen, and engage. And
what my ulterior motive in this
is to build community. We very rarely have the opportunity to sit and talk like this with each other about important stuff that we all do, and to share perspectives, to share experience. And you've surfaced some really nice ideas that I'm hoping some of you will join us and take lead on. The whole idea about transdisciplinary work and how some of this fits into that perspective is a topic in and of itself, and could be running alongside this, and we could pull a committee together to do this, a NAPA WAPA committee to think about this and come up with a short brief. Running this through a GDPR and UNICEF lens, I think, is a fantastic idea and something we really should do. And again, that's why we have we're having these conversations to generate this kind of perspective. But it comes back to having conversations, not presenting papers to each other and talking at you or us, but trying to figure out where are the commonalities that we need to be focusing on. And this set of professional standards is a place to start from, as everybody's been saying. And we're through all these conversations we're having, we've been surfacing all of these kinds of interesting ideas that would sit in somebody's head, or you would see somebody at the office or in the hallway and have a brief conversation, it would go away. We're starting to capture that on a much larger scale now to engage with professionals and academics about how we do this better, and ultimately how our students get trained so they walk into a field being better prepared to be a professional in that perspective. That's the real challenge. Most of us have been at this for a while now, and so all of the concerns and the issues that are being raised are based on good experience or bad experience. How do you convey all that to a student who's coming out of a traditional four-field school and wants to be like this? How do you take Suzanne's history and Laurie's history, funnel it into them in 4 hours? The really important things they need to know about. How do you take Ryle? How do you take any of you folks and put your experiences and your cautions and your opportunities in front of students so they can start building on that? I don't know how we do that, but I think these kinds of conversations are critical to what's going on. There was a question in the chat about SFAA. I sit on the SFAA board of directors. For those of you who voted for me, thank you, I think. I raise these issues with the board on a regular basis, and they're mostly people who are well inclined toward them. The challenge now is at the SFAA meetings, we'll be doing sessions about this, and to see what kind of engagement we get from membership. But again, this is something SFAA as an organization needs to be engaged with, because we're talking about our collective disciplinary future. If we don't help students and new professionals jump through this hoop, consider these things before they get started, we have not done them a service. And our service as senior professionals, as mid-level professionals, should be helping to ensure those next generations of people don't run into the same walls we did. We can say, there's a wall here, don't do that one. We'll find a different wall to run into. But channeling all of that information, all that experience is really hard, because these kinds of conversations don't happen very often. So trying to figure out how WAPA, NAPA, SFAA generate these opportunities, in contrast to reading a paper, talking about a particular academic concern like tenure or publications or those kinds of things, are important, but they're not germane to where we're trying to help students get. So thank you all.
Amanda.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm actually newly arrived in the US. I've come from Australia about 6 months ago, so the conversations are completely different in these two spaces. So this is very enriching for me, and I've also come here with the interesting task of developing a PhD program in applied anthropology at San Diego State University. And so really, Neil's last point is so it really is a point of reflection for me in terms of how do we build these kinds of frameworks and disciplinary standards into the pedagogy and the educational experience in setting up a PhD. And I'm in the process of trying to develop curriculum. So this is quite crucial, this whole event for me right now. But something I wanted to go back to from one of the early slides, because I think when I think about how do we teach professional standards and how do we work in this space as established practitioners, but also as mentors of a next generation, I'm really interested in the process that you went through in the beginning, which was described as reflecting on poor anthropology. So this interests me because I was recently subpoenaed by the federal court in Australia as an expert witness for an Indigenous community. And my job was to largely launch a critique, and a very scathing critique, of another anthropologist. And it was a very a professionally scary moment, going head to head with another anthro in the federal court. Because, and unfortunately, the idea of impact and the idea of risk and doing no harm, as we configure it as anthropologists, is, I now know, really up for debate in amongst our professional networks. And let alone, I mean, the whole event fell on deaf ears in terms of the judge, who had, I think the closing statement was that my commentary around ethics and doing no harm was somehow out of sequence with reality and the real world of doing applied anthropology. It was a very frustrating moment as somebody who tries to stay on the right side of the tracks in terms of doing no harm. So I'm interested that perhaps each of you could speak to what you understood to be poor anthropological practice. And perhaps it might be worthwhile thinking about prefacing the disciplinary standards with some framing about what constitutes poor anthropology. I think in order to teach our students coming through and our early career practitioners, knowing what poor behavior in the space might look like is a really interesting start point to think about better behavior as practitioners. So maybe if you could speak to me about how you went through that process, I'd love to hear more.
I would love to have us do that. I'm not blowing you off. I have four hands, and I recognize that we're running long. So let me come back to you. Okay, Joanne, and then Rue, and then Monica, please.
Okay, this had started as a follow-on for Suzanne, so I'm going to try to keep it very short. But Amanda, I think that may be a lovely topic for another session or salon or something. I think that's wonderful as a topic. And I don't know if I'm still on the program committee, but I'd suggest it. Anyway, Suzanne, when you were speaking, I kept thinking about all the wonderful things you did, having been in, sort of watching in various ways, several of them. And I'm thinking about what people say to me when they like my work, and other anthropologists in this room and otherwise. And it's that we're looking at things from multiple sides, and we're doing the whole thing, and we're bringing it together to create something which may be presented as 1, 2, 3 simple things, because you, Suzanne, know how to write this as a, program or whatever, and I have learned how to write this as policy or program or whatever. We all do this. That's an interdisciplinary thing, right? But we're bringing to this that sense of complexity and holism and whatever. And that made me think that maybe when you guys are figuring out how to highlight both transdisciplinary and what's unique, thinking about examples might be a good idea. And thinking about, examples that are not just research, but examples from policy, examples from, program stuff would be really wonderful. Matt's comments, I mean, you're not the only one, I suspect, who's an anthropologist in cybersecurity. There've got to be others. I think, having those many examples, just like having those examples of what's bad out there, running alongside, these precepts, which are sort of intentionally vague, might be a great idea. And I'll be
Thanks,
quiet
Joanne.
now.
Thank you. Rue.
Hi, I'm actually a student. I'm in my undergrad at George Mason for anthropology right now. So it was really awesome to get to participate and observe a meeting like this. I'm lucky enough that my school does get to cover a lot of this stuff, and they are very focused on like our professional development and knowing what we're going to get into in regards to like job fields and standards. But other universities and kids I know at other universities don't get to have that same information taught to them. So I think spreading more things like this is really important for like the professional development of students, and even getting to like view a meeting like this was very eye-opening and very interesting. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll look forward to you coming out and being a great PPA anthropologist. Monica.
Well, it's actually, thank you, Rue. It's a great segue, your point. And I guess this is a response to Neil's wonderful comments is, I think we need more intergenerational conversations around these things. I mean, I have a 23-year-old son, and he knows things I don't know and how the world is shaping up. And he's going to be influencing the direction. And I just think there's a lot to be learned from younger generations about the implementation contexts in which we'd like these values and standards to be practiced. So however that can be actualized, whether it's salons at the different meetings, but I think some type of intergenerational conversation, and that will help this incredible work be what you all have intended, which is a living document, right? It's just, it gets shaped and passed down and reshaped and tweaked. And anyway, so Rue, it's so great to have you here. So thank you for chiming in.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, we don't own it. We're caretakers and we're, masseuses, but we don't own it. And we are hoping others will pick it up and do things with it that will advance it and make it useful in different arenas for different groups. I would love to take a few minutes and respond to Amanda, but Amanda, we would also be delighted to have a one-on-one with you to talk about your issue, because it's a big issue. And a conversation around what we have all seen that constitutes poor anthropology. I think that could be, a fortnight's worth of conversation.
I did open the Pandora's box, I suspect. And it's why, this event happened in December and I am still processing. I will be processing for some time, I suspect. It's a shock to the system. But I really would love to have a one-on-one, an extended conversation about it, because I do think, having spent many years, in the ethics space, teaching to ethics, teaching my grad students, I often find sometimes the best learning comes with being presented with a conundrum, a dilemma that is usually based in an anecdote of somebody you knew who knew somebody who did something. And it usually is a really interesting sort of pivot point to build out around a real praxis of problem solving around best practice. And it's often quite hard to find examples of poor practice to work with my students, because nobody declares them. Often I only know about them because I've been a chair of ethics, and, in a very, soft way of retelling stories and cleansing them of anything identifiable, I work with those examples in mentoring. So yeah, unfortunately, sometimes, you have to look into the the abyss to kind of know how to be better in your practice. But yeah, I would love to follow up on the conversation, and I don't expect the time now, but any time is wonderful.
Yeah. Suzanne.
I don't know if this is the time, and I'm going to be really brief. I was on the board of AAA, and I cannot and will not go into any detail. However, we were made aware of an egregiously bad anthropological activity going on, let's say. And we argued and anguished, but we finally took action. Now, that was not everybody needs to go that far. Not everybody needs to take somebody to court either. But there are ways that some things were addressed, and I've seen it a couple of times at least. So.
Yeah.
One other request before this goes away. For those of us who don't do well with long webinars, is it possible to get the PowerPoint, which was lovely and accessible, and I was so happy, sent out to all of us, please?
You can certainly have the PowerPoint. It's also, that was a nice segue. Erica has just put up in the chat the web address for this, and it includes all of the concepts. And there is a webinar, and we are happy to share the PowerPoint, as long as everybody remembers that this is forming. We are in motion, and we keep shaping. So we're going to be presenting, I think it's already been said, at SFAA, and Victoria, I look forward to seeing you there. And then we're going to take everybody's feedback, and we're going to sit down and we're going to go through it, and we're going to figure out what we need to do next. And then we'll have a couple of presentations where we'll try out anything that we've changed, try it all out. And then eventually we hope we have a living document that we can put down for a little while, because we have other tasks we need to go on to as the Professional Development Committee. But this forms ground for us. And so we've put a lot of time into sharing it and getting feedback. So that was a long answer, Joanne, but it's in the chat. And yes, we're happy to share the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I can push out the PowerPoint when I push out the YouTube link. So probably by this weekend, hopefully.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? You guys have been amazing. Really, this is when we started this whole process, this is what we hoped for, was that people would give us useful, helpful thinking about how PPA anthropologists and others can use the standards. Lori, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a really quick point. You might want to consider, they call it socializing it now, which doesn't mean the same thing to us, but disseminating or sharing it with some of the institutions that have a lot of anthropologist practitioners, like the Veterans Administration. And the World Bank still has some, USAID definitely still has some. So some
Fish
of
and wildlife.
Yeah, exactly. So and some of the NGOs have it. If you went to the court, that would be. I just have one other quick point. It's really, really hard to be humble when you're dealing with people who are willfully ignorant of social science. And those of us who are public health anthropologists know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, humility has to be. You need to also take credit. You also need to be sure that our methods are not misrepresented and our findings are not misrepresented. And there's a moment to stick a stake in the ground. So, on behalf of NAPA's Professional Development Committee, we say thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you're going to be in Santa Fe, come to the presentation.
Yes, we want
And
to thank you so much for being with us this evening and for being willing to share these guidelines and for engaging in conversation. And do hope to see you in Santa Fe. And just as a reminder as well, that WAPA has several different sessions in Santa Fe. And so on the program, you will be able to find a wide array of sessions and also posted on the WAPA social media as well.
And Saturday night, for those who stick around, there is a WAPA NAPA social, mostly focused to students, but I'm sure others would be welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So if we could give one more round of applause for our
Thank you, everybody.
for everyone being with us this evening. And we will have this posted along with the slides for everyone shortly. Thank you to Matt for doing that, and wishing everyone a wonderful evening and a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Hi, Kathleen, Neil, and Matt et al.
Thank you.
Hi, Lori.
Hi, Suzanne. I want to go out for a drink with. Bye.
Me too.